Great. Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sophie Gerald, and on behalf of the British Neuroscience Association, I'd like to give you a very warm welcome to the second webinar in this series, which is hosted with our partners, the Psychiatry Consortium. Whilst online life is still very much part of the new normal, we'd like to note our real appreciation for your taking the time to share some screen time with us today. Just before we start, and whilst people are still joining, we have a few housekeeping rules to go over. We will be using the chat and Q&A function today, so do feel free to say hello and post comments in the chat. But if you have any specific questions for our speakers, then please make sure you use the Q&A function for these. You should see both the chat and the Q&A buttons at the bottom of your screen. There will be a Q&A session after the talks with a chance for our panelists to answer any questions you may have. So do feel free to post your questions at any time during the talks and we'll pick them up at the end. You can ask questions anonymously if you wish to do so. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that this webinar is being recorded with the permission of our speakers and will be available to watch on demand on the BNA's YouTube channel after the event. And finally, just a reminder to please adhere to the BNA's Code of Conduct for webinars and engage respectfully online. We are delighted to be working with Laura Ajram and the Psychiatry Consortium, working together to strengthen the links between psychiatry and neuroscience, highlighting the importance of a collaborative process between industry and academia within psychiatric drug discovery. We really hope this series will humanize the research story and provide an opportunity to openly discuss the different stages of the research pipeline from all perspectives, from people with lived experience of mental health and clinicians, to academic researchers and industry scientists. Today, we are focusing on the perspective of those who have lived experience of mental health challenges, which, given how 1 in 4 people are estimated to experience mental health challenges in their lifetime, means we are truly talking about a shared experience that many people will recognise. And to prioritise patient needs in the medicine's discovery process, we need to involve patients from the very beginning. And it's thanks to the extraordinary bravery of people like Simon Rose, who you'll meet today, that we are able to begin to comprehend the complexities and different perspectives of patients. As Simon notes, it is about the whole person and human approach, and how complex needs are recognised in terms of research. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Laura Ajram. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. Hi, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the Psychiatry Consortium. It's so great to be representing one half of this exciting partnership with the British Neuroscience Association today in this second of our 5-part webinar series. For those of you who haven't come across the Psychiatry Consortium before, I thought I'd give you a very brief overview to who we are and what we do, just to put this into a little bit of context for you. So in 2019, we launched the Psychiatry Consortium in response to the huge patient unmet need in psychiatry, with a primary focus on medicines discovery. We bring together medical research charities, pharmaceutical companies, academics, and small companies to drive challenging preclinical research for the identification and validation of new drug targets, with the hope that pulling the community together and providing funding for high-risk, very early drug discovery will drive a pipeline of much-needed new treatments for psychiatric conditions. And in addition to project funding and developing that pipeline, a really huge and very important key aspect of our work is to engage the research community globally through events like this, and by really trying to provide opportunities for interaction and collaboration. And this is really where our partnership with the BNA's Building Bridges Between Industry and Academia fits so perfectly and aligns really nicely. And as part of that, this series of webinars that we've co-developed comes together to look at that collaborative research process from all perspectives and all angles. And today I'm delighted to share the panel with our esteemed colleagues at the Royal Society of Psychiatrists to discuss arguably the most important perspective, that of those who prescribe and take medicines for psychiatric conditions. And without that perspective, how can drug discoverers know what we should be doing and what we should be focusing on? So I think this is a really important and insightful conversation that you're joining us here for today. So welcome to that conversation. Please do contribute through the chat and the Q&A section. So without further ado, I will kick off by handing us over to Professor Subodh Dave, who is the Dean of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and a consultant in the NHS. He's passionate about co-production and patient involvement, which makes him the ideal person to chair our conversation today. So I'll hand over to you now, Subodh. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, and warm welcome to everyone here today. It's pretty cold out here where I am. Am I audible, guys?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, that's fine. So warm welcome, everyone. A bit cold here today, but I can see that people are logging on from much warmer climes across the world. So wonderful to see all of that. Thanks for that kind and wonderful introduction. I mean, I think I really want to draw people's attention to the phrase "building bridges." Psychiatric research is quite complex, and I think as someone who participated in a molecular genetics research project as a trainee, I was a research fellow for 2 years at the University of Birmingham. I think what struck me and what has struck me since then is that psychiatry is very much at the cutting edge of science. I think we are the branch of medicine that invented psychobiosocial. We brought in the idea of a holistic understanding of and the complex understanding of the human condition, and our formulations in daily practice kind of reflect that. Sadly, I feel that research has not always kept pace with that, and I think that's partly due to the constraints of research, because obviously research has to be done in controlled conditions. And so, excuse me, for example, we've seen that genetic studies, for example, have been done mainly on subjects from a particular ethnicity, mainly Caucasian ethnicity, and therefore the findings are then not completely replicable for the wider population. I think we've seen certainly in the UK, Sajid Javid, our health secretary, in the news, talking about commissioning a review exploring the wider aspects of how medical devices, and pulse oximetry being one of them, was failing to represent the requirements and the needs of the wider population. I think in psychiatry, we particularly seen that. I think the average patient I see in my clinic has lots of comorbidities. It's very common for me to see people with not just mental health problems, but also comorbid physical health problems, and quite often substance misuse problems as well. Typically in research, I think we sanitize our subjects, I think, and we try and conduct research in such controlled conditions that we have to then ask the question as to whether that is fully replicable the findings are replicable in the clinical setting. So part of this is to do with research itself, but part of it, I think, is also been the lack of the patient voice in shaping and designing our research, in shaping and designing our research questions, in shaping and designing our research trial design itself, and also in shaping our dissemination efforts. I think we all know that there is a 17-year gap between the establishment of academic evidence and its dissemination in practice. So there are multiple areas, and I think for me, I think certainly, given my role in education and training, that's where I focused on. And I think I'm delighted to welcome Simon Rose, who is not only a great champion of the patient voice, he sits on the Royal College's council as the patient representative, but is also an esteemed colleague for me. And I think he's probably one of the very few. I mean, I think for me, Simon, you're the only one that I know of who is employed as a lived experience development worker and is actually pursuing a master's in medical education. So the phrase expert patient educator completely applies to you. And I think with Simon's help and with the help of my team, we've been developing the patient voice in medical education and psychiatric training. And I think very much want to see how we can build similar bridges in the field of research. So without further ado, let me invite Simon to share his thoughts and views. I've had a message from Trudy that she should be coming in soon. So I'll introduce Trudy, again, my fellow colleague, fellow psychiatrist, and registrar of the Royal College of Psychiatrists when she arrives. But over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Subodh. I'm not sure how to follow that really. For the benefit of UK-based delegates that are watching this, I will borrow from our Prime Minister's performance yesterday, and I promise faithfully to only mention Peppa Pig World if I get completely lost in my notes. But I'm Simon. As Subodh has just said, I'm employed as a lived experience educator within an NHS Foundation Trust. My role basically involves me supporting undergraduate medical students to access the specific knowledge that comes from having lived experience of mental illness. To that extent, I have significant lived experience myself. I have a postgrad certificate in medical education from the University of Sheffield. As Subodh says, I'm in the throes of upgrading that to a Master's in Health Professions Education at the University of Glasgow. More important than that though, I'm really proud to work with a group of around 50 people in Derbyshire who define themselves as expert patients, who all have lived experience of mental illness and who help us to help students to understand that specific knowledge. Outside of my day job, as Subodh says, I sit as patient rep on the Council of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and I've done bits and bobs with various other groups as well. And I'm delighted to be here to really to share an insight, but to challenge you to take us with you when you go on the journey towards drug discoveries. What I want to do to start off with is just to reflect on the nature of clinical decision making. For me, at its best, it's about applying evidence to individuals, and I think as clinicians and academics, you need to recognise that we are just that. We are individuals. We're individual in values. We're individual in expectations, in beliefs, and in biological makeup. And I think that kind of leads on to the main point that I want to make today, and that's that biological makeup is clearly vital in healthcare. You know, it underpins medications, it underpins medication development, it underpins treatments more widely. However, I do think that we need to recognise that especially in mental health, biological exists in the context of a patient's history. To borrow a phrase from the RC Psych, for as long as I can remember, I've been telling people that we need the very best doctors to choose psychiatry. You need to understand the science, and it's the science of the brain, which I'm not a medic or a scientist, but I suspect that's a fairly complicated organ to be dealing with. But we also need psychiatrists who understand that science can be shaped and impacted by life events, by environmental factors, by character traits, by a whole plethora of factors that are unique to each one of us. So when it comes to developing new treatments, to developing new drugs, I would urge you to take patients with you on that journey. Let us help you to understand the complexity, to understand how things fit together. You know, work hangs on the fact that knowledge comes from many different places. You know, there is undeniably a learned knowledge that comes from clinical experience, from science, from research practice. I think there's also a knowledge that comes from living with the sorts of issues that lots of us have to live with. And in all truth, I think if we want to be as good as we can be, if we want to be as effective as we can be, then we have to access all those multiple sources of knowledge. You know, if you only look through the eyes of a doctor, you see what a doctor sees. And that's not to say that the patient voice is more important. It's different. It adds something different to the equation. So what I want to do really is to illustrate some of the complexity by touching on my own experiences. Now, I'm often asked by students who I work with, what's the most effective treatment? Is it medication? Is it talking therapy? But the simple answer is I haven't got a clue, because nothing happens in isolation. You know, I've had talking therapy at the same time as taking medication. I've done all of that at the same time as coming out of some really quite toxic relationships. Is it an individual intervention that works? Is it a combination? Does some work but not others? Does some work because of others? I genuinely have no idea. But I think to help you understand, let me help you understand something about me. So I have got a diagnosis of recurrent depressive disorder, and I have associated anxiety with that when my mood's low. I've survived multiple attempts at suicide. I've been involved with mental health services for 26 years. That's literally half of my life. I'm 51 now. I was first hospitalized with mental illness at the age of 25. You know, over my adult life, it's led to multiple inpatient admissions, totaling perhaps 18 months in total. Perhaps more important than that, it's led to, I've had careers ended on health grounds. It's led to family breakups. I have children who previous partners don't let me see because of my mental health. Now, that can be taken at face value. Now, at face value, there is something physical happening in my brain. You know, I don't like the idea of chemical imbalance, but there's a physical process going on in my brain that can be corrected with medication. So at face value, you guys develop a medication, I take it, things are better. And I subscribe somewhat to that. You know, I take a combination of two antidepressants and an antipsychotic, and have done for, I've taken the same combination of drugs for the last 8 years. But maybe that's too simplistic. Maybe my journey started much earlier than the age of 25 when I'm hospitalized. You know, after lots of psychological input over the years, I'm coming round to the idea that it isn't actually, or it might not be, just me that's a weirdo, me that's defective. You know, maybe this started in childhood. And to give you an idea of where I come from with that, so I'm the eldest of 4 children who were born really quite close together. So I was born in August 1970. Daniel is my parents' 4th child, was born in December 74. So my parents had 4 children in 4 years, 4 months with no multiple births, which is, for me, it's a lot of children to start with. But then they started fostering children. So the first 3 that came into the household were subsequently adopted, taking us up to 7. But then they carried on fostering, and they fostered groups of up to 5 on top of the 7. So there was my mum and dad and 12 children. Truthfully, I don't remember huge amounts of childhood. Lots of it's blocked out. Lots of it I don't remember. My dad was largely absent. He went out to work. He worked shifts. I know from talking to him subsequently, he actually worked extra shifts to keep out of the way, because sort of 12 kids in one place is chaotic. And I think children that come into care clearly come with a lot of baggage. But somewhere along the line, my parents picked up a reputation for being able to deal with children with particular behavioural problems. I don't remember lots. Stuff I do remember involves being set on fire and furniture being thrown around. I remember my mum being hit. Lots of difficult, challenging memories. But the one thing that I remember more than anything is a sense of nothing being permanent, of people coming and going. You know, I would say goodbye to somebody in the morning that they were going off to be reunited with the parents or whatever, and you come home from school and they'd still be there because that hadn't happened for whatever reason. But conversely, I could go to school in the morning and come home and my bedroom had been packed up and I was sharing with somebody else because there was somebody new coming into the house. There was a constant state of flux. You know, the 7 of us were fairly permanent. The other 5, it was short-term placements. People came and people went. What I think that left me with is a sense that people are ultimately replaceable. The roles that anchor people, the roles that keep people safe and well and enhance a sense of well-being are transient. You know, whether that's as a worker, as a partner, as a parent, there's always somebody else that can do it. You know, my flawed thinking is that parents aren't actually needed. You know, my entire childhood is centered on the fact that you can pick a child up out of a family, put it in another group of people, and their life is better. What happens with me is that my mood dips, and that sense that someone can do these roles better than me starts to gain traction, and it gains traction to a point where suicide actually becomes a logical decision. You know, I am doing the right thing by people that are close to me because other people can do my roles better than me. So if I die, then they're sad for a bit, but ultimately the world carries on spinning and somebody else comes in and they do their role better than me, and everybody else's life is better, and I'm just not there. But it becomes self-perpetuating, because the lower my mood, the more I engage with that, the lower my mood is the pattern. And that's a pattern that's followed me throughout my life, really. You know, I don't remember thinking any different to that. And I think, you know, from lots of input from psychologists, I can look back and I can see how sort of isolative behaviours and things as a child keep you safe in the environment that I was brought up in. And I can see that, but the problem with it is there's no magic cut-off point where you realise, okay, so I'm not a child anymore, so I don't need to do those behaviours anymore, so I'm just going to stop. That doesn't happen. What happens is you carry on doing the same things as kept you safe in a child, to the extent now where I'm 51, I don't have friendships particularly. I don't actually know if I'd know how to build and maintain it. It sounds ridiculous, but it spins out of childhood. it's taken a long time and a lot of effort from a lot of people to get me to a point where I kind of accept that. And there's a huge barrier to accepting that. You know, it doesn't feel hugely safe to be in a position where you're criticising your parents or appear to be criticising your parents. It certainly, well, I struggle. What does it say about me for being critical about other people providing care for people who are significantly worse off than I am? What does that say about me? And then there's the thing, you know, to the outside world, they're saints for what they've done for all these children. You know, they're kind of garden party at Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen for because of all the stuff that they've done to help these children. And it feels so churlish for me to sit here and say, well, actually, you know, for me, it wasn't great. Medicine will help me with some of that. Medicine will help me with the symptoms of low mood. Psychology will help me with the symptoms, with the thought processes that drive those symptoms. What I'm able to do, I think, as an individual and as part of a cohort of patients, is help you guys to provide the context to the work that you're doing, because it isn't as straightforward as there's this process going on, so therefore we need to correct it with this medicine. Sabine talked about, well, I want to say biopsychosocial, but I think it's been flipped around now. But biopsychosocial for me is absolutely right. You know, as I said earlier, people say to me, is it medicine that's helped? Is it psychology that's helped? I don't know, because it's all mixed up together. But I need to help you to understand that it's all mixed up together. What I want to leave you with is something that I consider a bit of a bombshell, to be fair, but it truly captures the complexity of my situation. So I was encouraged some years ago by a psychologist to talk to my parents about what I'd experienced and how I experienced it. So I did. And my dad responded by telling me that my issues with mental health were all genetic from my mum's side of the family. I look back, my granddad had ECT back in the 1960s. Nobody can actually tell me why. He just suffered from his nerves, whatever that means. There's also a couple of, an uncle and an aunt on my mum's side who passed away from the complications around alcohol dependence. Then for my dad, it is genetic. It's genetic from my mum's side of the family. He then went on to tell me that because it's genetic from my mum's side of the family, it's actually inevitable that my mood will carry on crashing, and actually it's inevitable that eventually I'll die by suicide, which is horrendous. For what it's worth, I don't think he's right. I think you know, he is salving his own conscience and putting his own spin. But in terms of the context of what we're talking about today, what is it that's going on with me? Is it genetics? Is it epigenetics? You know, do I have a genetic predisposition that's activated by environmental factors? Is it simply something in my brain function? Is it social factors? I have absolutely no idea. But I can help you understand, and the patient cohort can more broadly can help you understand. Now let us work with you to develop stuff that will get the best outcomes for us, because out of anything in healthcare, the people that matter are the end users of the medication, and we can help you to understand what's important. You know, the title of this webinar talks about building bridges. For me, I think it's about recognizing what we both can bring to the table, recognizing the knowledge that all sides have in this, it's walking forward together for the benefit of people that use the medications that you guys develop. I will leave it for there and hand back to Sibaid, but there's nothing that's, well, I say there's nothing that's off the table in terms of question and answers. I've not yet found anything that is off the table, but I reserve the right to pass on questions, but if there is anything, please come back to me. But back to you, Sibaid.
Thank you, Simon. That was very, very powerful. As always, I've worked with you for so long, and I've heard you tell your story so many times, but each time it kind of, gives me some fresh insight, some fresh emotions, So thank you for being so not just candid and brave about your story, but also being so insightful and being very explicit about the challenges that science faces broadly, specifically psychiatry. There are lots and lots of comments praising you and and what you've said. So I'm sure you'll have the time to read them through. Trudy, could you put your camera on so that we know that you're here? Because I wanted to try and bring Trudy in. Hi, welcome, Trudy. So Trudy Senviratne, who is also a psychiatrist like myself. She's also an officer of the college. She's registrar of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, a renowned perinatal psychiatrist, has been awarded the OBE, and has worked and developed the field of perinatal psychiatry in not just the UK, but across the world. But is also very, very, very keen academic researcher and fully understands the issues that we are discussing today. And so over to you, Trudy, without further ado, because I'm aware that there will be questions, and I wanted to leave at least 10 minutes at the end to have a Q&A.
Brilliant, Sibaid. Can you hear me? Excellent. My goodness. I have to, Simon, that was amazing to listen to what you were saying. It's always incredible to listen to you. And it's just really wonderful to work with you, because I know that I've just come away sort of from reviewing some patients on the mother and baby unit just now. By the way, everybody, I had it all lined up to show you some slides with this talk, but as it so happens, something's gone wrong with the Wi-Fi on one device. I'm juggling with an NHS computer, so forgive me, we can't connect the two together. So I'm going to send the slides afterwards, and they will be circulated afterwards so that you can have a look at them. But we don't need slides, do we? We can hear what I have to say as well. So I hope that's okay. So forgive me for that bit of it. I can't tell you how important it is that we work together to increase the pipeline for medication production in psychiatry. It's so profoundly important to our patients, and it's so profoundly important to me as a psychiatrist that we change the story that we've had for the last sort of generation and longer. So I'm going to talk you through sort of some of the thoughts I had really when I was asked to sort of give this talk, and I'll do it. I'll try and do it in the 20 minutes that we have, but have some time for questions as well. Simon, it was really powerful to hear the sort of lived experience that you brought and the family story. And perhaps unbeknownst to me, part of what my sort of journey as a psychiatrist ended up being is that actually there appeared, way after I'd gone down the route of becoming a psychiatrist, my brother, in fact, developed a serious psychotic illness in his early 20s and ended up needing ECT, ended up being on a whole range of psychiatric drugs that gave him terrible side effects for most of his life. He's in his 50s now. So I've had this really extraordinary journey, I guess, for us as a family, but also for me as a psychiatrist over the last 25 or coming on, over 25, not quite 30 years, thinking about how important this is. So, you know, it means an awful lot, you know, in terms of what it means as a clinician, but primarily, gosh, this is what's so important for us as people and for us when we get ill with our mental health. That's a fundamental difference. And we are so slow in psychiatry compared to other areas in medicine. I mean, unbelievably slow. And that's a story I want to share with you, because we need to speed that up. We absolutely need to speed that up. And the way we speed that up is that collaboration with people, with patients, with the public, in all the ways that we do sort of drug innovation for psychiatry. It's not acceptable that people have side effects of drugs. It really isn't. We need to sort of tidy up and get cleaner drugs for everything, for psychosis, for depression, anxiety, absolutely everything. So, you know, in a way, even though we've had this sort of expanding repertoire of psychiatric drugs over the last chunk of years, since the late 40s, 1950s, many of which were sort of discovered by serendipity, perhaps in the early stages, there's still so much more to be done. If we think, for example, now we've had COVID, haven't we? So normally the pipeline for producing an antiviral drug for something like this, we know can be sort of 7 to 10 years. Actually, we've produced a COVID vaccine in no time. It wasn't even one group, it was several groups that produced a COVID vaccine through COVID. And I was only listening on Radio 4 this morning to, I've forgotten his name now, but the chap that's opening up this brand new Atrogenic centre. You know, there's a big science place to innovate drugs in Cambridge. They want to be a bit like the Silicon Valley, you know, the big, I guess, guns for drug innovation over in the States. And quite right too, we need to be innovating over here in the UK. And it's a really interesting relationship in the UK, actually, in the way people, patients, interact with drug innovation. There's a fear and there's a massive stigma. So that's one of the challenges, I think, the stigma and the fear in engaging, quite rightly, because actually, you know, there's a fear of side effects happening. There's a fear of, you know, well, actually, is this going to make me worse rather than better? But generally, there's a fear amongst people in engaging with psychiatric drugs. I think if you look at other areas in medicine, again, it's much greater willingness for people to get involved in medication innovations in the range of cancers, for example. Even, you know, people are desperate to have new treatments there, and Alzheimer's disease and other physical health causes. There's only tiny examples. And yet in our populations with, you know, psychiatric illnesses, and they are illnesses and they're paralyzing illnesses, people are much more reluctant. So if there was one wish I had, it would be that, actually, that we encourage and destigmatize and engage in that conversation much better than we have previously. So I'm just going to jump through my slides, but you can't see them all. But I've got a picture of lots of parents to, you know, people with mental illness who recover with their mental health problems. And that's one of the beauties, actually, of the area of psychiatry I've gone into, which is perinatal psychiatry, is that, you know, drug interventions are so critical in improving the depression and the anxiety and the psychosis, or the obsessive compulsive disorder, the new onset psychosis, the bipolar affective disorder that relapses. You know, it is a critical part of the makeup of what's required in that holistic program of care that's required for people. And we are very, very holistic. I like to think I'm very holistic, but actually the areas of social prescribing, eating well, exercising, sleeping well, doing yoga, doing infant massage, maternal massage, paternal massage, or part, you know, all of that is really important. The talking therapies are all really important as well, but actually psychopharmacology also uniquely has its place. But what I've been paralyzed over the years is the notion of iatrogenic harm, that actually, because we're not innovating drugs quickly enough, we are, you know, unwittingly causing iatrogenic harm. So what's a definition of, you know, what do we do as doctors? Now, when we take our oath of Hippocrates' oath, we talk about doing no harm, and we talk about non-maleficence, which is the obligation to not inflict harm deliberately on somebody. Now, of course, we're not going to do any harm, and of course, we don't want to do that, and we want to do good, which is, you know, what we absolutely say we want to do. And no psychiatrist goes out there to deliberately give side effects to a patient. We don't deliberately go and sort of give side effects, the weight gain of some of our neuroantipsychotics, the antimuscarinic effects of some of our antidepressants, the fact that, I see somebody in clinic and they tell me, yes, their mood is getting better, but they have absolutely no sexual, desire or libido anymore because of the side effects of the drugs. We don't want to do that. I mean, we'd much rather have, cleaner drugs that actually improve things. But the reality is getting people on board with the appropriate trials at the various stages of trial can be really, really difficult. There's real fear. And thank goodness, we no longer do some of the things from many, centuries ago when there were leucotomies and the such. But we now do have drugs, and these drugs really do work. Before these drugs started to be innovated in the late 40s and 50s, there were experiments, social psychiatry experiments, where patients with psychosis were allowed to wander around. Shenley is an example of an old asylum where patients were allowed to wander around without any medication at all and just wandering around in a psychotic state. And it was very clear that actually people needed medication. So it was, although some of the discoveries happened a bit by serendipity with the earlier drugs, nevertheless, they provided a framework for what could work. And let's not forget, actually, we talk about the iatrogenic harms of drugs, and that's not just in psychiatry, that's in all areas of medicine, isn't it? Some of our oncology drugs give terrible side effects to people. And here, we've worried about side effects of COVID, haven't we, as this has been innovated. But let's not forget iatrogenic harm caused by other areas of mental health provision. People forget actually that there's a whole, that in Britain, for example, there can be an anti-medication brigade. There is in the world, anti-ECT brigade. Actually, talking therapies can also cause iatrogenic harm. If people get the wrong type of therapy with the wrong therapist, with the wrong type of intervention which somebody doesn't want or need, that can also cause harm. And actually, we need to balance out that holistic care for somebody, which is very much based on what the individual wants. So it's brilliant that in the 50s we discovered something like chlorpromazine, and then moved on to imipramine and fluoxetine. It's good, and it's good then that this process became tighter. We have a really tight process where we have the initial sort of, I guess, the millions of compounds or multiple compounds that go through the initial process, which get weaned in to the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, and then onto a filing process, and then they become nice concordant. But really, even in those phase trials of, where initially it starts with a small number of people who don't have an illness, and then it moves to people who do have an illness to watch for side effects before things get scaled up. There's a real, I'd come back to stigma, there's a real lack of, I guess, lack of willing sometimes, but also more fear in engaging in some of those trials. In the FDA in the States, the Food and Drug Administration have managed to push through some newer drugs, and we have, for example, ketamine and nasal sprays of ketamine coming through that has been approved in the States. It's still not approved over here in the UK. And some of that reluctance from patients' perspectives, as I said, is that fear of getting side effects, but also, risky things happening. And as a clinician, I'm also frightened that something might happen. I'm frightened as a clinician to say, please, why don't you have a go, take part in that trial, see if that works. I was really delighted on our mother and baby world that we were able to encourage in perinatal mental health. We know that the biology of psychosis happening immediately after childbirth is often linked to that sudden drop in hormones that happen from antenatal period to postnatal, where you have a sudden drop in estrogen and progesterones. So I was really pleased that, lots of patients who had bipolar affective disorder, for which there is a very known, there's up to sort of a 50% risk of relapse of an illness just after childbirth. So it's a huge risk of relapse of psychosis or psychotic depression. And women were willing to try having estrogen patches because of that sudden drop in hormones that happen. a natural thing you could do biologically is to top that up by giving estrogen patches immediately after birth, and to see whether that made a difference. And in a trial, what we were able to show is that actually it did make a difference. It meant that the same number of women relapsed, so it was still, the relapse rate was still around 50%, but the women those that had estrogen patches had much lower doses of antipsychotic medication, and therefore less side effects of the medication. And that's moved on now to there being a trial of a new drug called brexanolone that came out as an IV infusion. The studies, unfortunately, we couldn't engage in the UK for this because there was too much fear. I come back to the issue of fear. There was fear amongst clinicians across services, and the group that were able to take this forward was over in the States, and Samantha, very good friend and colleague, Samantha Brody's group. I would love for that to be different. I would love for it to be different, that we can innovate drugs here, that we can be courageous enough to take part in that. And that has to be that conversation between clinicians, pharmacological companies, pharma, and of course our patients and people. And I think we can get there, but I think we need to get rid of that fear before we can move forward. And I really like our college as a Royal, I'm the registrar of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I really like our college to be more proactive in this state. That I think our college needs to support the innovation of drugs, being the Royal College of Psychiatrists, because if we don't support it in this, in the UK, quite frankly, I'm not sure I know who would support that. And it saddens me. I mean, I've come away from a clinic today where, from a ward reviews today, where, one lady was on sodium valproate, which now should not be given at all in pregnancy. Luckily, her baby didn't develop abnormalities at all, but she had chosen to stay on it using a sodium valproate license because that was the only drug that had kept her well with her severe schizoaffective disorder. But as you know, sodium valproate is a drug that shouldn't be taken now in pregnancy because of not just congenital malformations, but also long-term developmental delays in the child. And drugs like our newer antipsychotics, they're not that new anymore, but things like olanzapine, they cause weight gain, give you gestational diabetes. So that's not very good, that you're trying to keep somebody well with their illness, but at the same time you're causing them to develop diabetes in their pregnancy. But really there are many new drugs coming on the market. As I said, brexanolone is one of them. We have new psilocybin drugs that are appearing on the market, which are there to help with a whole range of mood, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. You have a new one linked to brexanolone called, I think it's called zuranolone, or Sage 215, because it's with Sage, the company. So there are interesting new compounds on the way, and actually, having had a period of relative sort of inertia with psychiatric drug innovation across the world, I'd say in the last sort of 5 years or so, there's a sudden need. We know that psychiatric illness affects 1 in 4 of us, that at the worst end of the spectrum, people take their lives. And in awful situations, yes, somebody may also take the life of somebody else. That's something happens in my world, because mums can take their lives and very rarely take the life of their baby. So those terrible things happen, but more so it's a suffering, and biology has its place, medication has its place. So I'm going to stop there, Subodh.
Thanks,
okay,
Trudy.
Because I could probably go on for ages.
No,
but just
thank
to
you.
say, I'd love to have a bit of space for conversation.
Thank you, Trudy. That was really very, very, very good. There are a couple of questions, and the first question is really quite interesting. So let me maybe start off by asking maybe Simon to comment on this briefly, and then Trudy, next you. So the question from Kevin is that given the sliding scale of diagnosis, and I think it's referring to the dimensional view of psychiatry for psychiatric diseases, the potential of overlapping diseases and the likely early years impact on disease, how can clinical trials be designed to select patients for for target specific drugs. And so I guess, Simon, the question also, and being slightly provocative there, is that, given the need to quantify research and have research that is replicable, etc., is it really feasible to kind of involve patients with their widely varying experiences? And you mentioned the individual variations in beliefs, expectations, all of that. So let me start with you, and then we'll go to Trudy next.
I mean, it's undoubtedly a complex issue. I think in terms of the selection of patients for trials, I would trust you guys to select your patients for trials. It needs to be broad. It needs to catch as many people as you can. I do think that there is a piece of work to be done about improving trust between patients and pharma. It was interesting to hear Trudy talk about chlorpromazine. Chlorpromazine is in the suite of drugs that I take, and I regularly get told by other people within the service user community that it's a dirty drug and that I shouldn't be taking it, and that the only reason that I take it is because it's cheap. The reality is I make my own mind up and it works for me, which is why I take it. And I think until we can build a sensible dialogue, and it's a dialogue that needs to, from a patient point of view, it's a dialogue that needs to recognise that harm is sometimes done by medication and harm is sometimes done by services, and we get to an understanding not of greater good. That greater good is a step too far. But in that general direction, until we start to have those conversations, I think we're going to come up against the same issues.
Thanks, Simon. Trudy.
Yeah, and I think, Simon, whatever works, it's absolutely fine. Just in response to the thing you said about chlorpromazine, it's still prescribed and it's still used, and it's, if it works, I think that's fine. I guess one of the points I was thinking is that actually we need to move, that was 60 odd years ago, wasn't it? We need, much clean, in a way, that word cleaner, but one that's more specific to the issues that the medicine is trying to tackle. So in that, I think it's a brilliant question, because of course symptoms do overlap, don't they? Some of the anxiety and the depression and sometimes the psychosis. And I think and that's one of the challenges in drugs that affect our central nervous system and our brain. But I think, if you have a really good study design and try to focus on one area of symptomatology and not try and do the whole lot all at once, that's what I think, that's a good design and a good medicine, that, a good trial will try and focus on one particular set of symptoms. Let's not try and tackle the negative symptoms of schizophrenia and the cognitive deficit seen in schizophrenia, along with a medicine that might be used for somebody with severe depression. Yes, we know that they can overlap, but we know actually enough of the science now that some of the neurological, neuronal pathways are slightly different. We've got scanning data now, as well as other data that we can lean on. So I think that's one of the important things to do.
And Michael has got a very similar question, I think, which kind of touches upon what you both have just said, and I think which is around, is our understanding of psychiatric diseases good enough? And I think we know the placebo effects are quite high in clinical trials, and if our view on what is going on in psychiatric disorders isn't good enough, isn't it time to join forces with basic research to widen our understanding of specific CNS diseases? I mean, just to kind of push it to its very extreme end, this question, that should psychiatric research be essentially neurological research? Let me frame it that way. And I think because that is the discussion today, really. And I think should we come going towards the hard end of that, where we can actually categorize things more categorically, or should we be looking at the other end, which is complex, but which there might be ways of doing that?
I think just to come in from the the perspective of what we've learned in the Psychiatry Consortium of trying to fund this type of research is that it's very clear that there is a big gap in our understanding of the neurobiology of psychiatric disorders, and it is light years behind other fields. And that does make drug discovery in this space much more challenging, because whereas we can try and find new targets to drug and new ways of modulating brain systems, we don't actually know enough of the basic science of how those systems operate at all. So knowing how to modulate them is then a very difficult challenge to try and face. So I think there is, particularly in this field, a huge amount of work that needs to be done with basic scientists. And I think we need to be working across all of those disciplines to inform that basic science, because patients need to be saying what their lived experience is and what the actual manifestations of those biological changes actually look like, and clinicians need to be telling us what we need to do and what we need to treat and what we need to target, and bringing all of those into the discussion at the basic science and having a truly translational approach, which is both back and forward translation, I think is possibly the only way that we're going to tackle this.
Thank you, Laura. That was really good. And I think it highlights the importance and in a way segues neatly into the next question, which is from Craig around as a bench scientist trying to convince people that a single piece of biological jigsaw might provide insight into a bigger unknown picture can be quite a challenge. And I think that's a challenge for basic scientists. And then what approaches can Amdc and clinicians support to enable us to bring together learnings from both biology and the human experience?
I think I'm just going to refer this to Simon, actually, because I think this picks up on something I was thinking as Trudy was speaking, and saying that there's a fear of a lot of things that you mentioned. You said come from a fear of how to involve patients or what to do. And I think on the lab side of things, there is also a fear of when and how to properly involve people with lived experience in their research. And sometimes that means that people do it as a token, and once they finish the research, they then check how to disseminate that research, which is great and needed, but probably should have come a step before. But that fear, I think, can sometimes manifest as not actually doing anything, because this is just perceived as it's so difficult to get all of these perspectives into that basic lab question. So Simon, I wonder whether could you comment on some practical steps that researchers in the lab could take to involve patients in their research?
My starting point would be to employ patients to do that job. I think there will be an instant barrier from a scientist or a rep of the pharma the pharma going to pay that the conversation it needs to happen in spaces where service users where patients are, and it needs to be supportive. Things like today feel helpful. It feels like the start of a dialogue, but it's a dialogue that really does need to develop, and I'll leave it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. Well, if I can just add quickly, I think that Laura, we were in that space maybe 15 years ago when we started our training program in education and started involving. So now Simon works with 50 expert patient educators who are involved in medical education. I think we all went through a process where there was that awkwardness, and I know that a lot of my colleagues still face that, but it's possible to overcome it. And I think as Simon says, it's really about being genuinely committed to involving the real voice, rather than it being tokenistic, as you rightly pointed out. And I think I also don't want to castigate people for the fear, because I think the fear is understandable and genuine. I think a fear of the unknown, fear of not offending, fear of saying anything that might upset people, and the kind of kind of seemingly antagonistic relationship that has existed in the past. So I think to rebuild trust, I think is the key, and I think if you build that trust, I think there are ways of going ahead. Because the last minute, I want to take Andrew's comment, I think, which is that it seems more than ever that we have the ability and the moral obligation to use methods that validate subjective patient experience with drugs. So, for example, I think Andrew's suggestion is that we could use natural language processing of patient testimony on side effects that are complex or hard to quantify, and cross-reference this information with pharmacogenomic databases. I won't ask you, Anufy, to comment on that, but I think it's a good note to end on. I think just shows that there are ways, more ways than one, in terms of involving the patient voice and their subjective experience. I think partly it's also about devising new scientific methods to incorporate the voice, but by and large, I think it's really about effectively building trust and involving them genuinely in a co-productive way, so that we are partnering from the very start, So I think from research, question, design. So I think there's increasing emphasis on PPI, and I think it's important that we don't go down the tokenistic route with those PPI involvement. And if we can avoid that, I genuinely feel quite optimistic that there will be some strides that we all have wanted, in this field for such a long time. So thank you, Laura and Sophie, for organizing this, and thank you all, the delegates who've been attending. Thank you to Simon and Trudy for your wise, and insightful contributions today. Are there any final words from Sophie?
Hello, yes, just to say thank you. I don't know if you can hear me okay. Laura, can you?
Yes.
I don't have the controls on, so I can't put my face on, so I'm strictly non-visual, but huge thank you to Sabo, to Trudy, to Simon, to Laura. Just a fantastic panel discussion, really, really worthwhile, and I hope that we'll be able to follow it up in the not too distant future. just superb. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, and bye for now.
Thank you
Bye
so
for
much.
now. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.